going to leave the hierarchy up because it will help in the discussion quite a bit. Okay, so now we have an idea of what observation is. The next thing that I want to talk about pertains to observation. And it's important to understand this because without a true understanding of basically both of these things, you won't be able to recognize and identify problems within the structure. The next thing I want to discuss is what's known as the processes, right? And processes and workflow are sort of tied together, but there's a key distinction, so I'll describe them different. Okay. In a process of evaluation, the process of the system, what I'm looking at is the dynamic nature. So this is, before I begin, this is processes. Right? So what we're talking about now is processes, right? And the first thing to recognize is that when we're talking about program evaluation and we're talking about processes, the very first thing to realize is that we're always talking about processes as dynamic, right? The processes, by definition, are dynamic. D-Y-N-A. Right? Processes are dynamic systems. And what do I mean by dynamic? They're changing systems. They follow a particular trend. I mean, there's a lot that I can get into this. I can't, though. There's a whole discussion on trends. There's a whole discussion that I will tie into workflow as a separate issue. But the system, the process, is a dynamic process. So for example, in this system, if I'm evaluating a process within this system, the question is, how would I identify a process? Well, here's a key sort of generic example of a process question. How are orders filled by this company? Right? The question, so how are orders filled by your company, is a question that relates to the process. From the point of sale to the point of receipt of sale, the product being exchanged or the service being exchanged, that span is a discussion on the process, the workflow, right? So the classic example that comes to mind, I saw a pretty cool documentary on UPS and how UPS fills orders. And they have this incredibly intricate barcode system and a package moving trailway thing that's like acres wide, and it senses the thing and it pushes packages to their proper zip codes. That's the process, and literally it's a dynamic process. It's on wheels, right? It occupies trucks and such. So the question, from the time the order is placed until the time the customer receives the product, what happens, right? That's a dynamic process. That's a dynamic system. Asking questions like that are questions that probe into the process of this system, right? So as an effective program evaluator, one of the key things that you can ask is, how are orders filled? Right? How are orders filled? If you're not doing something like product-based, let's say you're doing a program evaluation for curriculum, right? The question would be, how is, so a sub-question might be, how is a new class created? Right? How is a new class created? How are orders filled? Right? These questions, how is, are questions that direct the program evaluator to the process, right? In understanding this process, obviously this is going to be conversational, right? It's a bit of the Socratic method. So I'm speaking with the CEO, he directs me or she directs me to someone else, and I ask, well, how is the curriculum created? How is this class created? Or how are your products filled? Or how do you provide that service? In getting a response to those questions, which I should be writing down on a notepad, the answers that I'm getting are identifying the process, right? It's identifying the dynamic nature in which this thing is created, or this product is rendered, or this service is satisfied, right? So the most important thing to recognize is that the process is dynamic. What you can do to arrive at an identification of the process is ask these type of questions, right? And the next thing to recognize is that since the process is dynamic, since this process of flow from a beginning point to an end point is a dynamic process, it's almost impossible to actually analyze process dynamically. So what does that mean? It's almost impossible, let's go back to the UPS example. It's almost impossible for me as a program evaluator to go into the UPS building to put to see like someone put their name on a package to send it to Santa Claus. It goes into the building, it's routed, for me to follow that, right? There's no real way for me to follow the package from the beginning phase to the end phase. There's really no way for me to do that. You can, it would be exorbitantly expensive, it would require an exceedingly ridiculous amount of time. Because the first thing to recognize is that within any corporation, within any system, there are multiple processes functioning at any given time, right? So that systems, corporations, businesses, universities, whatever it is that you're analyzing, always have multiple processes. If you're evaluating this corporation and the CEO tells you that, listen, sales have been down for the past 3 quarters, and I don't really know why. I think it's the engineers and the salespeople. There's some tension going on, but I don't really care. I don't really know. That's why I hired you. Figure out what's going on and tell me what I need to do in order to get my profits back to where they need to be. Right? When you go in there to begin the analysis, what you should recognize immediately is that the nature of this business, the nature of this hierarchy, is that it is comprised of multiple processes, right? There's the process that the engineers do to create the engine. There's the process that the salespeople do to market, to distribute, to package, to sell. There's the process that HR has. There's multiple processes within any system. In order, and this is the last point, in order to identify where the problem is, I have to recognize in which process does the problem reside. And I'll write that on the board. So the last thing is that the program evaluator has to recognize in which process, WH/ is which process does the problem, reside? There's a lot of dynamic processes going on. There's the engineer actually ordering the raw material, like say steel, from some steel manufacturer, and then the distribution of that steel from the manufacturer to the actual plant, and then the creation and the fabrication of that steel into frames, and so on and so on. And the salespeople have graphic designers that have to create the advertisement that is then sent to the printers, which is then distributed through venues. And you get the point, right? There's many different processes. You can't go into a program thinking, I'm going to evaluate all of the processes. You'll be there indefinitely, right? You're not being an effective program evaluator if you try to evaluate all the processes that a system contains. What you want to do is you want to pinpoint possible areas of problem, discrepancy, and identify specifically those processes to then see if you can locate exactly where the problem is. The way that I do this specifically is if I've already been given sort of the idea, the go-ahead, the foreknowledge by the CEO that, hey, I think the problem as a CEO might reside within my sales or my engineering team, what I do is I do the following, right? I'll do the following.